Hello everyone. Welcome to part 4 of chapter 7 Mother's Day. Again here we are continuing the discussion of question and answers. So we have question number 12. What reason does she give, I mean to say Mrs Pearson, Cyril for not making the tea? When Cyril again asked for tea as he had been working for an 8 hour a day, Mrs Pearson replied that she had done her 8 hours already and henceforth she would work only for 40 hours a week. She declared that she would have her 2 days off on weekend. Question number 13. What, according to Mrs. Pearson, were her plans for the weekend? Well, as already been hinted, Mrs. Pearson tells her children that at the weekend she would have her 2 days off. She agreed to make beds and cook a little as a favor, conditional to how she was treated. Mrs. Pearson tells her children that in case they did not like the arrangement, they would go elsewhere for weekend. Question number 14. Why was George Pearson surprised when he came home? What was the answer that he got? Well, as usual, for George Pearson also this was a surprise, the changed behavior of his wife. Mr. George was surprised to see Doris crying and was shocked to see Mrs. Pearson sipping beer, or you can say stout. He said that it did not look right. Mrs. Pearson replied that it was a nice change and it had been quite some time since he was surprised at her. So unpredictable behavior, and he got the answer which he had never expected. Question number 15. What did Mrs. Pearson say to her husband when he was angry with her for not making tea? Well, Mrs. Pearson was very reasonable here. Mr. Pearson informed Mrs. Pearson that he did not want tea but grew angry at being told that he was not ready. She taunted him that if he went to the bar at the club and refused a glass of beer and showed irritation because they had not prepared it earlier. So, how would he feel? He would invite ridicule. Question number 16. What was the truth about Mr. George Pearson that hurt him the most? Well, this is quite hurting as well because Mrs. Pearson told George that he was one of the standing jocks in the club. People called him Pompey Pearson, as he was called Pompey Pearson because they thought that he was slow and pompous. She was surprised that he spent so much time at a place where people always ridiculed him, leaving his wife at home. And even his son Cyril also agreed that yes, dad, they call you Pompey Pearson and they make fun of you at the club. Question number 17. What was Mrs. Fitzgerald's reaction to Mrs. Pearson shouting at Cyril, and why? Mrs. Fitzgerald was in reality Mrs. Pearson, as we all know it. So when she saw Mrs. Pearson, the real Mrs. Pearson, shouting at Cyril, she protested as she was actually Cyril's mother. But Mrs. Pearson told her not to interfere. Question number 18. What were the two slips that could have let out the real identity of Mrs. Fitzgerald? What were the two occasions where their plan was almost revealed? Mrs. Fitzgerald, in her nervousness, addressed Mr. Pearson as George, which a strange woman cannot say. Only a wife can call like this. Mr. Pearson is surprised to be called thus, but Mrs. Pearson covers up for Mrs. Fitzgerald. Later, when Mrs. Fitzgerald attempts to slap George following an argument, the real Mrs. Pearson exclaims and calls out to her, Mrs. Fitzgerald. So, which confuses George. Question number 19. How was the experience of two women after the change of bodies? This question has been almost a repetition. The real Mrs. Pearson, now Mrs. Fitzgerald, had not enjoyed the experience as she had just seen her family being treated roughly and rudely by Mrs. Fitzgerald. On the other hand, Mrs. Fitzgerald had enjoyed the experience as she had been able to teach Doris, Cyril, and George Pearson a lesson to value Mrs. Pearson. Next question. What was Mrs. Fitzgerald's advice to Mrs. Pearson after she had put back the family members in their proper place? Mrs. Fitzgerald advised Mrs. Pearson not to be soft and waste all effort. She had put it to change the attitude of her family for the better. Mrs. Pearson is unsure how she would explain her behavior, but Mrs. Fitzgerald warned her not to yield and not to give any kind of explanation. Otherwise, everything will go in vain. Question number 21. What was the change that came over the Pearson family in the end? Well, when Mrs. Fitzgerald left, Mrs. Pearson's family was relieved to see her smile. Mrs. Pearson decides to stay home for a family game of rummy and have the children prepare dinner. They readily agree and gather around Mrs. Pearson as the play ends. This is the end of today's lecture. That's all. Have a nice time.